Hello and welcome to the third episode of the 2001 Suzuki RM125 build that one of you will win. It has been a crazy week here in this garage. I tore the CR500 all the way down to the frame. I've got parts everywhere, but more parts have arrived for this RM125 build and we are ready to get going on rebuilding this engine. If you missed the first two episodes, I stripped the bike down to the frame, pulled the engine all the way apart, Cerakoted the cases this sweet titanium color that I think is really going to look great with the other accents I have planned on this engine. I also want to let you guys know the 3 bikes, 1 bear hoodies are coming back specifically in honor of this RM125 build. 3 bikes, 1 bear is an edit we made a couple years ago on 3 Suzuki RM125s ripping through the woods. So this hoodie is in honor of that and Suzuki 2-strokes in general. So these will be back in stock on the website. They are available for pre-order right now, and each one of these hoodies gets you 2 entries for a chance to win this bike when it's done. So I have a complete engine rebuild kit and clutch components here from Wiseco, as well as a fresh clutch hub from Pro X as the stock one had some wear on it. So I've got everything I need to get this engine build rolling. If you would like a chance to win this bike when it's finished, along with a trip out to Montana to come rip it with me, links are down below to go get yourself entered, and let's get it started. Step 1 is putting the cases in the oven at 300 degrees for about a half hour, and while those heat up, let's dig into this Garage Buddy engine rebuild kit from Wiseco. This is a pretty extensive kit, including bottom and top end gaskets and seals, a brand new crankshaft, a piston, crank bearings, and an hour meter. Pretty much the only thing it doesn't contain is transmission bearings, so I bought those from Hot Rods and put the bearings and crankshaft in the freezer. Now while these components get hot and cold appropriately, let's take a look at this new performance clutch kit from Wiseco. I'll talk more about the benefits of this clutch basket during clutch installation, but if you recall from last episode, I pressed the Kickstarter gear out of the old clutch basket and it needs to be installed into the new basket. In order to do that, I also put the gear in the freezer and the basket in the oven. While I install these brand new Wiseco clutch rubbers onto the basket, I would also like to let you guys know you can save 10% over on wiseco.com with the code KP10. Wiseco has provided huge support to this channel over the years, and I only work with companies I believe in. Wiseco parts have been top-notch for every build I've used them on, and I would highly recommend their clutch and engine components. Now this wasn't the greatest footage, but the Kickstarter gear pressed right into the basket in one smooth motion. I installed those rubbers first as I didn't want to deal with trying to rotate the gear once installed. Also, one more quick moment to shout out this Tusk workbench mat. For a task like I just performed and what I'm about to, this mat is perfect. I usually put a t-shirt on the bench for tasks like this, as with metal on metal, you risk damaging parts and scraping up the workbench. You will also see lots of Tusk tools used in this video, and everything Tusk is available from Rocky Mountain. Using the link below helps support the channel. I torqued the bolts securing the plate to the clutch basket to 80 inch-pounds as suggested by Wiseco, and then I flipped the basket over to peen the edges of the bolts. To do so, I simply take a punch and a hammer and give the edge of the bolt a whack to essentially lock it to the basket to minimize the risk of bolts backing out. It is a very small area to try to focus my camera on, but here is a somewhat blurry close-up of what that looks like. With the new basket ready to go, I moved on to the engine cases. Now this first crank bearing is an example of a poor installation at the fault of my own. You can see as I place it, it goes in a little bit cockeyed, causing it to get stuck and not fall smoothly into the recess of the case. Not a problem, as I can take my Tusk bearing and seal driver and carefully hit the outer race of the bearing to cause it to seat. You never want to hit the inner race, as that will damage the bearing. The second crank bearing is an example of a nice, smooth installation. Most of the transmission bearings dropped right in as well, with the exception of a couple, and you can see I utilize the same method with my bearing driver. Note, if you have to drive bearings in, there is an audible sound change when they are bottomed out as they should be. Here's the sound before a bearing is seated. Here is the sound after. Some of the transmission bearings require retainers, and I use red, high-strength stuck nuts thread locker to secure these bolts. While I install the retainers, it's story time. A couple years back, I built a 2003 Suzuki RM125. MX Tech Suspension worked with me on that project, which was a big deal, and we were scheduled to test the bike down in Utah before bringing it to California for a shoot with Motocross Action magazine.
The bike ran perfectly when I tested it at home, but had a bog at the track while testing in Utah. We tore the carb apart trackside, and I was embarrassed that my first shot at something like this wasn't going so well. After reassembly, the bike was running properly, but not 20 minutes of riding later, the bike got stuck in fourth gear. The engine had to come apart to figure out what was wrong, and that was the end of that opportunity to bring the bike to California for a magazine shoot. I vividly remember sobbing as I left that track, feeling like I had failed and let other people down. I drove back to Montana and took the engine apart, only to find one single transmission bearing retainer screw that had backed out. I will take that as an enormous learning experience and always double check that these things are adequately tightened. I also use JIS screwdrivers from Prime to help avoid stripping these heads, and then I do go for another quarter turn with a driver that allows a little more leverage. With those retainers confidently secured, the final step before installing the transmission and crankshaft is seals. With the seals from my Wiseco engine rebuild kit, I began with the crank seals. Note, for seals with a metal outside edge like this one, you want to be very careful to install them straight, as you are likely to damage them if you have to remove them and start over. Also note, these crank seals do not go all the way to bottoming out, but rather sit flush with the case. This is due to the fact that there is an oil passageway where oil can drip down the cylinder and into the bearings to keep them lubricated. If you were to bottom out these seals, that would block this passageway and your crank bearings would dry out. I pressed in the remainder of the seals, most of which installed easily, but I had a little trouble with the shift shaft seal. Instead of struggling with it, I grabbed a bolt and a socket and pulled the seal into the case. I installed the new oil drain bolt, which threaded in effortlessly as we addressed these helicoiled threads and their reliability in the last episode. I then grabbed my engine blocks, as it was time to install this new Wiseco crankshaft. I addressed this during my CR250 build back in 2023, but I always get some comments regarding Wiseco crankshaft reliability. Wiseco has acknowledged and addressed there were some quality control issues with their cranks years ago, but they have since revised their materials, designs, and components through several iterations to address these concerns. The big end pin bearings are Japanese sourced, and the connecting rod material is Japanese steel sourced specifically for these crankshafts. I have a high level of confidence in this crankshaft's reliability. The crank came out of the freezer, and sometimes they drop right into the bearing and other times not. This time around, I did utilize my Tusk crank puller to pull the crankshaft into that bearing. Also note, a list of parts and tools used in this video can be found on my website, and that link is in the description below. I finessed the transmission into the case before installing the 3 shift forks, followed by the shift drum. Once the forks were aligned in the drum, I installed the shift fork shafts, and this crankcase was just about ready to bolt together. Note, the transmission should spin freely and smoothly with the forks and drum installed correctly. I added some grease to the crankcase alignment pins and gently tapped those back into the case half with a mallet. The RM125 is one of few engines I've built that uses a center case gasket rather than sealant. I vividly remembered this because when I built that 03 RM, I put the crankcase together 5 or 6 times without the gasket, wondering what was causing it to bind up. I called my dad to ask for his thoughts, and he said, "Did you make sure there isn't a center case gasket?" And sure enough, after looking at the parts diagram, there was. After lubricating the transmission just a bit more with some assembly lube, the right crankcase half slid over the transmission and crankshaft, and with some gentle, even taps with the mallet, I seated the 2 case halves together. I have this brand new engine fastener kit from Bolt Motorcycle Hardware, but these bolts will only be installed temporarily, and you will find out why in a future episode. This kit contains all of the external bolts and nuts for your engine. With the case bolted together, I could then trim the center case gasket. As I prepared to install the clutch, I soaked the clutch fibers from that Wiseco Performance clutch kit in engine oil. The little holder I'm using is from a subscriber, and they are 3D printed and really do come in handy. I first installed the gear shift mechanism, followed by the kickstarter shaft, idler gear, primary gear, and then finally the clutch. Funny enough, this 1/4 inch drive deep 10mm socket I used to torque this bolt is the one I found inside my first snowmobile when I was taking it apart.
What's that? Oh, no way. No way. It's a 10 mil. It's a 10 millimeter.
Now, as we arrive at the clutch installation, let's talk about this Wiseco basket one more time. These baskets come with a lifetime warranty, are stronger than any billet option, are hard anodized and Teflon coated, meaning they essentially do not notch or break, and if they do, Wiseco will give you a new one. And like I said, I've got a new clutch hub from Pro X as well, as the OEM one was notched. One thing I want to discuss and showcase during this clutch installation is the fact that the OEM lock washer replacement for the clutch is smaller than the one that was in it. In fact, it is so small that there is no usable lip or edge to bend the lock washer as it is intended. I specifically remember running into this with the 03 as well. So if anyone in the comments has some insight here, I am curious to hear. I'll show you a close-up in a second, but you might notice I have a new clutch holding tool. I finally bought the Motion Pro clutch holder, which is on the pricier side, but its adjustability will ensure I never break another clutch hub, at least I hope. The fingers are more precise than the style of clutch holder I've been using for years, and for how frequently I do this now, it was time. Here is the close-up of what's supposed to be that lock washer behind the nut, and you can visibly see there is nowhere it overhangs or provides enough space to actually bend. This is something I will need to address. For the time being, I continued engine assembly, installing those Wiseco steels and fibers, the push rod, and then the pressure plate. The Wiseco clutch kit also came with new springs, which I installed and torqued to spec, and I couldn't forget the primary gear was not yet torqued. To lock the engine here, I utilize a Motion Pro gear jammer, but I want to show you something to be aware of. With the jammer being aluminum, it will break and chip. Look at this small piece that broke off and was sitting on the primary gear. I learned this the hard way as I destroyed the camshafts of my KTM 350 many years back because a small piece of aluminum from the gear jammer somehow managed to clog an oil jet. With my lesson learned there and aluminum scraps eliminated, I installed the bottom end exhaust valve components before pressing a new water pump seal into the inner clutch cover. I also replaced the impeller since the old one was pretty grimy, and then I installed a new gasket along with the inner clutch cover onto the crankcase. I again temporarily bolted on some new hardware from that Bolt engine kit, quickly cleaned up the countershaft with a Prime MX wheel, and installed a new 12-tooth front sprocket from Primary Drive.
Now you guys know I'm keeping it real with you on the whole timeline of this build. The fine details take time, so this engine is at a brief standstill while I wait to get some hardware back from Nick's Vapor Honing Services, who is replating it along with another Bolt engine hardware kit, but in a different color thanks to Nick. So if you want to see this engine finished, be sure to click that subscribe button as we are on the road to 200,000. And now let's see if we can figure out how to dye this fuel tank black. I've got a couple pounds of RIT Proline black dye, a bunch of salt, some white vinegar, some laundry detergent, and I just went to the hardware store and got this big pot for this fuel tank. I was asked if I needed help at the hardware store, and I said, yeah, I'm looking for stock pots. And he said, what are you cooking? And I said, dirt bike gas tank? He got me all squared away. I feel like Kevin from The Office right now.
I'm serious about this stuff.
Also, I've never done this before. I actually found this method in another YouTube video that I will link down below.
After filling it up with water, I mixed all of the ingredients together in the stock pot and put it on the stove. Note this dye is not particularly cheap, as I spent about $65 on 2 pounds of it, so hopefully this works. I mixed it up and dunked the fuel tank. The instructions on the dye say to let the item soak for about an hour, but this dye is also meant for clothing and other items. I noticed my pot maybe wasn't getting hot enough with the one stove burner, as in the video I watched, his was really boiling. I used some aluminum foil to keep some of the heat in an effort to raise the water temperature, and you can hear it boiling a little better. I checked the tank and it looked like it was indeed accepting some color, so I recovered it and let it soak. I also noticed I didn't have the burner on full blast, which would probably help. Another hour or so later, I checked the tank, and what do you know? The bottom half is black. I flipped it over to each side, letting each part of the tank soak for over an hour. After rinsing, the tank came out kind of a purple color. Now raw like this, it is kind of ugly, but with graphics and all tied together, this color might work. That said, I wanted to see if I could get it a little darker, so I let the tank soak for about 3 more hours. Here is the current outcome. I'm still not loving it blank like this, but again, with graphics, I think there's a chance this color works great. I won't be making any final decisions on this tank right this moment, but I'm not upset with the progress. Now here is a sneak peek of some more parts that'll be going on this bike in future episodes, so be sure to subscribe.
Let me know what you guys think of this fuel tank. I will say, when it's not in harsh, direct light, it looks pretty darn good. When it's got these bright fluorescents beaming down on it is where you can see that yellow peeking through just a little bit. But like I said, the fact that it's coming out kind of purple with the purple accents on the bike might end up looking really good. That'll do it for episode 3. Go cop yourself some merch or direct entries if you want your chance to win this bike when it's finished. I'll be back very soon with more episodes on the RM125 and the CR500. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.